At the modern terminal of Hudson Gateway Airport, the Friday afternoon crowd surged without pause. But for Captain Ethan Carter, the atmosphere held a more personal weight than in any of his 27 years of flying. Standing at the very front of the jet bridge, shoulders squared in his neatly pressed pilot uniform, his tense eyes fixed on a scene he knew would change the course of his career. Two teenagers, one with a sharp, defiant gaze that reminded Ethan of his late son, the other with eyes guarded, as if concealing a history of pain, were being led out of the first-class cabin of the aircraft he was commanding. Their backpacks were hastily stuffed, their faces flushed red with humiliation as surrounding passengers looked on with a mixture of suspicion, judgment, and sympathy. "This isn't right," Ethan muttered, his hand tightening around the passenger manifest. The weight in his chest came not only from what he was witnessing, but from all the times before, when he had stayed silent, when he had followed procedure while his conscience had urged a different path. He watched the boys being led away, and in that moment, Ethan made a decision that would set off a chain of events none of them could foresee. Not even the boy's billionaire father, who would appear the next day to demand justice, wielding an influence that few dared to ignore. What no one realized was that this seemingly routine encounter had inadvertently intertwined their fates, exposing truths buried beneath layers of convenience and privilege. It would become a test of character. The line between justice and revenge had never felt so fragile. Ethan Carter hadn't slept for 3 nights. The nightmare of a plane in free fall, while he sat helpless in the cockpit, had returned, leaving him exhausted and on edge as he ran pre-flight checks for the journey from Lakeview City to Bay Bridge. At 58, Ethan was one of North Star Airways' most seasoned pilots, renowned for a calm demeanor so consistent that colleagues called him Steady Carter. But today, his hands trembled slightly as he scanned the passenger list. "Everything okay?" Cap asked Rachel Connors, his sharp young first officer, glancing up from the control panel. "Just another chaotic Friday?" Ethan replied with a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's hope we're not delayed this time." Rachel nodded, but a trace of doubt lingered in her expression. Ethan turned away, not wanting to be examined further. The truth was, last week's incident, a near miss over Silver Pine, had deeply shaken him, even though the technical report concluded it was a systems error. Ethan wasn't so sure. He felt like his own response had been a beat too slow, and that thought gnawed at him every day. As he made his usual round greeting the first-class passengers, Ethan's eyes landed on 2 teenage boys who had just taken seats 2A and 2B. Amid a sea of tailored suits and conversations about stocks or board meetings, the boys stood out like vivid streaks of color, vibrant and alive. The older one, with closely cropped hair and bronze-toned skin, nodded politely. "Good afternoon, Captain." His voice was careful, like someone used to treading lightly in spaces where he didn't quite belong. "Good afternoon," Ethan replied, this time with a more genuine smile. "First time flying with us?" "Yes, sir. I'm Caleb Dawson, and this is my younger brother, Miles." He gestured to the boy beside him, lighter-skinned, dusted with freckles. Miles looked up from his phone just long enough to say, "Hi," then immediately returned to whatever was occupying the screen. "Adopted half-brothers," a flight attendant whispered as she passed Lauren Mitchell, whom Ethan knew for her strict professionalism. Still, there was something cold in her tone that made Ethan glance back at her, but her face remained expressionless. He continued chatting with the boys and learned they had just completed a week-long tech camp in Lakeview. Caleb, 17, spoke clearly and confidently, describing the app they were developing to support students with learning disabilities. Miles is the real programming genius," Caleb said with open pride, nudging his brother gently. Miles, 16, emerged from his digital world just long enough to explain, "We're using adaptive algorithms to create personalized learning paths. Most apps don't even account for neurodiversity." Ethan couldn't hide his surprise. "Sounds like you two are on your way to becoming tech billionaires." The brothers exchanged a glance, their eyes reflecting both irony and caution. Caleb simply answered, "We just want to build something useful, something that helps people, sir." Ethan continued down the aisle, but that simple statement stayed with him, quietly resonating in his heart. "Sounds like you two are on your way to becoming tech billionaires," Ethan Carter said, a faint smile flickering in his eyes. The Dawson brothers glanced at each other in exchange that left Ethan unable to decipher their true emotions. There was something in it that felt both amused and guarded. Finally, Caleb spoke up, his voice sincere. "We just want to create something useful. Sir, if it can help someone, that's good enough." Ethan continued past the rows of first-class seats, his eyes unconsciously sweeping the cabin. As he passed seat 1A, a middle-aged woman leaned toward her travel companion and whispered just loud enough for the entire row to hear first class has really gone downhill. Anyone can sit here now as long as they rack up enough points. The words slid down Ethan's spine like a cold blade. He didn't look back, but he memorized the woman's face meticulously made up, yet with eyes sharp and judgmental. Back in the cockpit, he tried to refocus on the controls. The pushback from the gate went according to the usual rhythm, but in his mind, something felt off. Not a technical issue, rather. It was his instinct, honed from thousands of flights, telling him this one would be different. And he was right. About 40 minutes after takeoff, just as the seatbelt sign was turned off and first-class service began as usual, a voice crackled through the intercom into the cockpit. "Captain Carter, this is Mitchell in first class. There's an issue that needs your attention." Ethan glanced over at Rachel Connors, who was reviewing the instruments. She raised an eyebrow. "Want me to take over?" "No need," he replied. "Engaging autopilot. Probably just a VIP passenger with a special request." But as he stepped into the first-class cabin, the scene before him was anything but routine. Lauren Mitchell stood stiffly in the aisle next to seats 2A and 2B. Her posture was taut, like a stretched wire. The two boys, Caleb and Miles, sat still, their faces showing growing confusion and panic. "What's going on?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice calm. "These two passengers are being accused of stealing another passenger's wallet," Lauren said, pointing at the boys. Ethan looked over at a man in his early 60s, face flushed red, arms crossed, his designer suit adding to his commanding presence. "That's right," the man interjected before Ethan could respond. "I went to the lavatory and left my coat on the seat. When I came back, the wallet was gone. Then I saw these two whispering and looking around. Very suspicious, sir." "We didn't take anything," Caleb replied. His voice was steady, but Ethan noticed his hands were trembling slightly. "We've been sitting in our seats since takeoff," Miles added. "If that's the case, then you shouldn't mind having your bags checked." The man set his tone, making it clear this was not a suggestion. Ethan quickly identified the man from his name badge, Gregory Shields, vice president of a major financial corporation, a man used to giving orders and having them followed. The two teens tried to stay composed, but the public accusation had clearly shaken them. Now, all eyes in the first-class cabin were on them. "Mr. Shields," Ethan began, striving for objectivity. "Perhaps we should— I know what I saw. Shields cut him off. They were loitering near my seat when I came back. If they've done nothing wrong, then checking their bags should be no issue. The situation was escalating. Some passengers started paying close attention. Others pretended to be absorbed in books or screens, hoping to avoid involvement in the uncomfortable moment. Miles spoke up, his voice clearer than before. "We haven't left our seats. Maybe your wallet fell somewhere, or you left it in the lavatory. Are you saying I'm lying or careless?" Shields snapped, and making a few heads turn in surprise. "No one is saying that." Ethan quickly interjected. "Mr. Shields, I understand your concern. We'll handle this discreetly. A flight attendant can check the lavatory in the area near your seat while I review the security protocols." "Not good enough," Shields said flatly. "I want their bags checked now. Otherwise, I'm filing an official complaint with the airline and requesting security to meet us upon landing. Once again." Ethan felt the familiar pressure tighten around his chest, the tension between following procedure and doing what felt morally right. According to North Star Airways policy, theft allegations were to be handled discreetly, prioritizing passenger comfort, but every instinct in Ethan's body told him this situation was wrong. The boys' posture, their consistent reactions, and the fact that only they were being singled out, despite many passengers having moved about the cabin, all rang alarm bells. As Ethan weighed his next step, Lauren Mitchell leaned in and whispered, "Captain, they're flying on buddy passes, not official first-class passengers." Her tone was neutral, but the implication landed heavily. Ethan felt a chill. Buddy passes, discounted tickets for airline employees' family or friends, allowed upgrades to first class if space was available. But that didn't make these passengers any less worthy or deserving. "That has nothing to do with the current situation," Ethan replied, more sharply than intended. He turned back to Shields. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but I cannot permit a search of their personal belongings based solely on suspicion. If the wallet isn't found nearby, we'll follow standard procedures after landing." Shields' face darkened. "So you're taking their side?" Gregory Shields growled. "Do you even know who I am? I've been a platinum member of this airline for 15 years. This isn't about sides, Mr. Shields," Ethan Carter replied, his voice retaining its usual calm. "It's about following the proper procedures that apply to all passengers." The standoff might have dragged on endlessly if not for the sudden appearance of a flustered-looking man emerging from the restroom a few rows back. "Excuse me," the man said, walking toward the tense group. I found this on the floor, near the lavatory." He held up a shiny black leather wallet. "It has your business card inside. Mr. Shields." The air fell completely silent. Shields snatched the wallet, quickly checking its contents with hurried motions, then muttered something that sounded vaguely like an apology, but he didn't look at anyone, and quietly returned to his seat. A wave of relief washed over Caleb and Miles Dawson's faces, but Ethan noticed something else, too, something familiar, a quiet resignation, as if this wasn't the first time they'd had to face baseless suspicion. "Thank you for standing up for us, Captain," Caleb said softly. His voice was slow, but sincere. Most adults, they just... He didn't finish the sentence, but Ethan understood. Most people would take the easier path. Please the VIP. Avoid conflict. End the matter by assuming the kids who stood out were at fault. "Try to enjoy the rest of the flight," Ethan replied, though he knew how hollow the words sounded after what they'd just been through. Back in the cockpit, Ethan couldn't shake the sense of unease creeping through him. There was something about those boys that lingered in his thoughts. Was it their composure under public humiliation, or the strange calm they carried despite their youth? All good, Rachel Connors asked as he returned to his seat. Not really. Ethan exhaled. Just a pretty unpleasant false accusation. Rachel looked at him for a moment, as if wanting to ask more, but turned back to the instrument panel, choosing to respect her colleague's silence. The rest of the flight was smooth, but Ethan's mind never fully settled. As the plane began its descent into Bay Bridge airspace, the incident replayed vividly in his thoughts. What disturbed him most wasn't just Shield's blatant false accusation, or Lauren Mitchell's subtle bias, it was his own hesitation. In that moment, caught between instinct and regulation, he had almost chosen silence, and that filled him with shame. As the plane taxied to the gate, Ethan resolved to check in on the boys, just to make sure they were truly okay. It might be a small gesture, but he knew he needed to do it for his own conscience. But when he returned to the first-class cabin after shutting down the engines, he was met with a sight that made his chest tighten. Lauren Mitchell was standing in front of Caleb and Miles, her expression cold as stone. Unfortunately, your return tickets have been changed. Due to overbooking, you'll be seated in economy class on tomorrow's flight. This is standard policy for buddy pass travelers, she said firmly, her tone flat. The boys looked confused and disappointed, but more than that, they didn't seem surprised, as if they were used to being treated as if they didn't belong. That's not acceptable. Ethan spoke up, stepping forward without considering the consequences. This flight isn't overbooked. I've already checked the manifest. Lauren flinched slightly at the interruption, but quickly regained her professional composure. Captain Carter, this is a ticketing matter. These passengers are flying on buddy passes, and those tickets are always subject to change without notice. Let me see the updated passenger list, Ethan said, extending his hand, his tone leaving no room for refusal. A tense pause followed. Then Lauren reluctantly handed over the tablet. Ethan scanned the data quickly. Just as he suspected, there was no overbooking. There were still 3 open seats in first class on the return flight. Exactly what I thought. No overbooking, he said, handing the tablet back. There's been a mistake. These 2 passengers will keep their assigned seats. Lauren's lips tightened. With all due respect, Captain, this falls under passenger services, not flight operations. The change has already been entered into the system. That familiar pressure rose in Ethan's chest again, just like the one he had felt during the near collision over Silver Pine. But this time, it didn't make him hesitate. It made him resolute. Then reverse the entry, he said, his voice low and firm. Right now. He knew the other passengers were watching, but this time, he didn't back down. If you don't, Ethan Carter said, lowering his voice as he stepped closer, I'll file an official report for discriminatory behavior toward passengers under my care, and I will name you directly, Lauren. Lauren Mitchell's face stiffened, her eyes cold as steel. But any rebuttal she might have prepared was interrupted by the timely arrival of a ground crew member at the aircraft door, signaling that passengers could begin deplaning. We'll discuss this later, Lauren said, stepping back with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She turned toward the disembarking passengers, her rigid posture betraying the simmering anger beneath her professional exterior. Miles and Caleb Dawson looked up at Ethan with a mix of surprise and something else cautious gratitude. You didn't have to do that, sir, Caleb said quietly. We're used to it. It's because you're used to it that I had to, Ethan replied, feeling the full weight of his 58 years in his shoulders. No one should get used to being treated unfairly. He paused, then added, Your return tickets are unchanged first class. tomorrow afternoon. I'll make sure of it." "Thank you, sir," Miles said, a smile breaking across his face for the first time all day, lighting it up. Most adults don't do that. They usually just let it slide. "I used to be one of them," Ethan admitted. "But eventually, everyone has to ask themselves what kind of person they want to be, even if it takes them a while to get there." As the two boys gathered their things and exited the cabin, Ethan remained standing in first class. He knew he had just crossed the line, a move that couldn't be undone. He had challenged a colleague, disrupted an unspoken hierarchy of privilege that existed not just in aviation, but across society. And the consequences of that decision wouldn't stop with this flight. But for the first time in months, maybe even years, Ethan felt a lightness in his chest. The recurring nightmare of a plane plummeting out of the sky, while he sat powerless in the cockpit, suddenly seemed less terrifying. He had made the right choice, not the easy one, not the safe one, but the right one, and whatever lay ahead, Ethan knew he would face it with the same clarity he felt now. The next morning, in a gleaming glass office, on the 50th floor of Everett Innovations, Elijah Everett stepped out of his private elevator with steady strides and the familiar sharp gaze of a man who had built a tech empire from scratch over the past 2 decades. At 49, Elijah carried the poise of success, impeccable suit, flawless tie, and a meticulously groomed appearance. But what people remembered most about him was his terrifying focus, a dangerous sort of calm. "Good morning, Mr. Everett," said Myra Patel, his executive assistant, hurrying to keep pace with him. "As always, you've got a 9, meeting with the Singapore investors. R&D needs your sign-off on the quantum computing proposal before noon, and your ex-wife called twice." Elijah paused briefly, a motion so subtle most wouldn't notice. But Myra did. Though divorced for 3 years, the connection between Elijah and Vanessa had never completely severed because of Caleb and Miles, the 2 boys he loved as his own. "What did she say?" Elijah asked, accepting his usual coffee from Myra Black. No sugar. Precisely the temperature he preferred. Nothing specific. But she sounded worried. Myra replied carefully. "She asked you to call back as soon as possible. It sounds like it's about the boys." A flicker of concern crossed Elijah's eyes. Caleb, his biological son with Vanessa, and Miles, Vanessa's son from a previous relationship. Raised by Elijah since age 7, had just finished a summer tech camp in Lakeford and were on their way home. Both boys were precociously intelligent, responsible, and the rare source of light in Elijah's otherwise demanding life. "Call her now," he said, changing course toward his private conference room. "Hold all other calls unless it's urgent. Once alone." Elijah pulled out his phone, dialed Vanessa's number, and braced himself for whatever had prompted her to call so urgently. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying a blend of familiar warmth and weariness. "I've been trying to reach you since last night. I just got back from Tokyo," Elia said, though he knew she already understood how packed his schedule was. "Is something wrong with the boys? Are they okay?" "Physically, yes," Vanessa replied, and the way she said it made Elijah's heart sink. "But something happened on the flight yesterday. Something you need to know." Then she began to explain every detail, every public insult, the false accusation, and how the boys were nearly bumped from their first-class return tickets without a shred of justification. As she spoke, Elijah's expression darkened. Anyone who knew him would recognize the warning sign, not a loud, fiery anger, but a dangerous silence, the tightening of his gaze, like a storm gathering on the horizon, ready to break. "And you're sure it was the flight attendant Elijah Everett?" asked, his voice unusually calm after hearing Vanessa's full account. "Lauren Mitchell. Yes. Vanessa replied. But Elijah, that's not all. The boys said the only person who stood up for them was the captain, Ethan Carter. He stopped the seat downgrade. That information gave Elijah pause. In his entire career, he had rarely seen anyone in authority willing to risk themselves for strangers, especially for two black boys with no visible support. When is their return flight, he asked, already beginning to form a plan. There's something else, Vanessa continued, her voice slowing. This morning, the boys received a notice that their flight was canceled due to operational reasons. They were rebooked on a different airline, economy class, with a layover in Clearwater. They'll be getting home 6 hours late. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. When Elijah finally spoke, his voice had returned to the tone that had unnerved countless rivals in the corporate world, soft, but forged from steel. Send me their booking details, and tell them not to go anywhere. Stay at the hotel. I'll handle this. Elijah. Vanessa hesitated, concern in her voice. I know that tone. What are you planning to do? I'm going to make sure our son is treated properly. Elijah cut in, his anger surfacing in the tension behind his measured words. And I'm going to show Transatlantic that discrimination doesn't come without consequences. But just remember, Vanessa said more gently, Caleb and Miles need a father, not an avenging angel. Her words gave Elijah pause. The anger that had been surging through him like a tide receded slightly in the face of her grounding reminder. He had built his career on shaking up broken systems, a strategic disruptor, the press often called him. But when it came to the people he loved, he sometimes forgot how to strike balance. I'll remember, Elia said quietly. But both of them knew the wheels in his mind were already in motion and not about to stop. I'll bring them home safely. Tell them I love them. The call ended, and Elijah sat silently for a long moment in the quiet of the private conference room, his eyes fixed on a distant point, his mind moving rapidly through possibilities, next steps. Then he pressed the intercom button. Myra, cancel all of today's meetings. Ready the jet for immediate departure to Bay Bridge. And I need everything you can find on Transatlantic Airlines' executive structure, board members, recent PR incidents, especially anything on Captain Ethan Carter and flight attendant Lauren Mitchell. Understood, sir. Myra responded without the slightest surprise. Long accustomed to her boss's sudden course changes, anything in particular to focus on, she asked. Employment history, internal evaluations, any signs of prior incidents. I want to know if this is isolated or part of a pattern. Elijah paused for a beat, then added, and one more thing. Book me a first-class seat on this afternoon's transatlantic flight from Bay Bridge to Lakeford. The same route the boys were originally booked on, Myra repeated, already understanding his intention. Exactly, Elijah confirmed, his voice returning to that calm, cool rhythm. It's time I experienced their customer service personally. Less than an hour later, Elijah's private Gulfstream lifted off the runway, soaring west. During the flight, he reviewed a rapid analysis Myra had compiled. Transatlantic Airlines had, in recent years, been involved in multiple controversies over discriminatory practices, from inconsistent treatment of economy-class passengers of color to more discreet bias against discounted fare travelers. Each time, the company had issued public apologies and promised enhanced sensitivity training, but the real-world impact had been minimal. What caught Elijah's attention most was the airline's current CEO, Victoria Hargrove, a familiar name in the industry, known for her iron-fisted leadership, hardline stance with labor unions, and an unwavering focus on shareholder returns. Myra had also uncovered a leaked internal memo, a strategic directive encouraging maximum profitability from full-fare passengers. while subtly discouraging concessions to buddy-pass travelers. There were no explicitly discriminatory terms, but the language left enough ambiguity for frontline staff to interpret as they saw fit. As for Lauren Mitchell, her employee file showed over 20 years with the airline, with numerous commendations from VIP passengers. Not a single formal complaint on record. That made Elijah even more cautious, because the most skilled bigots often knew exactly how to behave without leaving a trace. In contrast, Ethan Carter's file was almost entirely unremarkable. A quiet LinkedIn profile, a few lines in a trade magazine about a safety initiative, and a single quote in a local article about a charity flight for children with cancer. A seasoned pilot, known for doing his job well and for avoiding the spotlight altogether. Elijah Everett's private jet had just landed in Bay Bridge, and a multi-layered plan had already taken shape in his mind. The first step was to go to Transatlantic's customer service center at the airport to address the cancellation of his son's tickets. If that didn't yield the desired result, he was fully prepared to escalate, possibly even meeting directly with CEO Victoria Hargrove. What he hadn't anticipated, however, was literally running into Ethan Carter, the pilot, who had intervened the previous day. As he strode toward the service desk, their shoulders suddenly collided. "Sorry," Elijah said reflexively, not yet registering the other person. "My fault," the middle-aged man replied, stepping back courteously. But then he paused, his expression shifting with recognition. "You're Elijah Everett." Elijah gave a slight nod. That sort of recognition was common for someone as well known in the tech world as he was. "And you're Ethan Carter," Elijah asked in return, captain for Transatlantic. "I had the honor of flying with your sons yesterday from Lakeford." The coincidence threw Elijah off balance for a brief moment. He looked closely at the man standing before him, average build, likely in his late 50s, a face marked by time and responsibility, and a rare, steady gaze. "It's you," Elijah said slowly. "The boys spoke of you with real admiration. Thank you for standing up for them." Ethan gave a small nod. "I only wish I could have done more. I just found out their return flight was canceled. I was on my way to scheduling to get some answers." "Then we're heading the same way," Elijah replied, beginning to feel that the man before him might be a potential ally. "I think we should coordinate." Ethan hesitated slightly. "Mr. Everett, I should be honest with you. I've already drawn attention for challenging Lauren Mitchell's decision yesterday. If I keep pushing, it could get me into deeper trouble." "Or," Elijah said, locking eyes with the pilot, "you could provide a valuable internal perspective. And please, call me Elijah." Their eyes met in a quiet moment of mutual understanding, no longer passenger and pilot, or billionaire and airline employee, but two fathers, two human beings facing the same injustice. "In that case," Ethan said with a faint, knowing smile, "I should let you know the customer service center won't help much. The cancellation was handled by Central Ops. The person in charge is Tony Morales." "And where can I find Mr. Morales?" Elijah asked, his tactical map shifting instantly. "Ordinarily, no one just walks in. That area is restricted access," Ethan explained. "But I can get you in. Whether he agrees to see you, that's another matter." "Oh, he'll see me," Elijah said calmly, but with unmistakable authority. People usually cooperate once they understand what's at stake. Ethan gave him a look, measuring someone who had just shifted from opponent to comrade. "This isn't just about a rebooked flight, is it?" "No," Elijah admitted. "It's about a pattern of behavior that needs to change. About my son's learning, they don't have to accept being treated as lesser just because of where they come from. And about transatlantic learning, the same that discrimination carries consequences." And what consequences exactly? Ethan asked cautiously. That depends on how this conversation with Mr. Morales goes. The two men navigated through the airport's restricted corridors, Ethan using his security badge to bypass checkpoints. As they walked, Elijah couldn't help but wonder more about the man beside him. May I ask? Ethan, why did you intervene yesterday? I'm sure you've witnessed similar situations before. Ethan was silent for a few steps, clearly weighing his words. You're right. I've seen plenty, especially young passengers of color, being unfairly targeted. And I'm ashamed to admit that, most of the time, I did just enough to stay out of it, hid behind the excuse that it was outside my authority. He paused outside an elevator, his expression pensive. But recently, I've had to face some hard truths. About a month ago, we had a near miss in midair. Equipment failure. Only thanks to my first officer's lightning-fast response did we avoid disaster. The technical report cleared me, but I know my reaction time was slow. The elevator arrived, and the two stepped inside. It was just them and their unspoken thoughts. Caleb and Miles were the turning point. Ethan continued. When I saw them being falsely accused, when I saw how they held their dignity under all those judgmental stares, I couldn't help but think of my own son. If it had been him treated that way, and no one stood up, how could I live with myself? You have a son, Elijah asked, feeling genuinely curious for the first time about the man beside him. So composed, so quietly brave. I did, Ethan replied softly. Michael was killed in Afghanistan 8 years ago. He had just turned 22. I'm very sorry, Elijah said. The words were simple, but deeply sincere. Ethan nodded, accepting the sympathy with the quiet demeanor of someone who had long since learned to live with grief not as an enemy, but as a silent companion. Michael was mixed race. My wife was black. He faced a lot of prejudice growing up, but he never let it define him. He once told me, Dad, anger's not always bad, but you have to know when it's useful and when it just pulls you under. The elevator doors slid open to reveal the controlled chaos of the operations center. Rows of desks with flight information monitors, weather maps, personnel schematics. Ethan led them through the busy space to a glass-walled office, where a middle-aged man was engaged in an intense phone call. Tony Morales, Ethan whispered, Regional Operations Director for the West Coast. He's the one who approved the ticket changes for your sons. Elijah peered through the glass. The man inside had a defensive stance, his hands clenched tightly as he spoke. He looked tense. High-pressure job, Ethan acknowledged, but that doesn't justify injustice. When Morales hung up, Ethan tapped on the glass and signaled a greeting. Morales saw them, frowned slightly, then motioned for them to enter. Captain Carter. Morales nodded, then turned to Elijah. And you must be Elijah Everett. I was just about to call you regarding your son's ticket situation. How convenient, Elijah replied, his voice icy. I'd like to hear your explanation for what operational issue required canceling their flight and rebooking them on another airline with a significantly worse itinerary. Morales shifted uncomfortably. It was a last-minute aircraft change. We had to reduce the passenger load. The two boys were non-revenue passengers and were on the transfer list. Interesting, Elijah said, eyes locked on Morales, because the information I've received says the original aircraft is operating normally and that flight is still scheduled as planned. There must be a system error, Morales began, but Ethan cut in. Tony, I checked the flight status before coming here. No aircraft change, no reduction in capacity. Flight TA-1057 is still flying the 737-900 as originally planned. A heavy silence settled over the room. Morales ran the numbers in his head, then sighed and turned to his screen. "Let me recheck," he said. There could have been a communication breakdown somewhere in the process. Elijah stood with arms crossed as Morales scrolled through the passenger data. After a few minutes, the man's expression soured. "There was a manual override logged this morning," he admitted, "not due to operations. Someone manually reassigned the bookings. Who made the change?" Elijah asked, though he already had a sinking suspicion. Morales glanced at Ethan, as if searching for support, but was met only with a waiting stare. The update was made by Lauren Mitchell, with supervisory approval from Gerald Shields. "Winners," Ethan repeated, stunned. Elijah's eyes narrowed. "Any relation to Gregory Shields, the passenger who falsely accused my sons yesterday?" Morales swallowed hard. "His brother. Gerald is our director of Eastern Regional Services." And just like that, the pieces fell into place. The false accusation, the downgrade attempt, the ticket cancellation. It was all part of a petty chain of retaliation enabled by invisible power and a blind corporate culture. Elijah felt the rage rising an old, familiar fire that had won him battles in billion-dollar deals, but also the same fire Vanessa had once warned him could burn bridges that shouldn't be burned. "So let me confirm," Elijah said, each word solid as stone. "An executive at Transatlantic canceled my son's flight as retribution for a false accusation made by his brother. Is that correct?" "Mr. Morales floundered. "I can't speak to the motivation." "Mr. Everett, I can only tell you what the system logs show." "Then let me speak to the motivation," Elijah continued, his voice not loud, but resonant like a bronze bell. This was a clear act of discrimination, fueled by personal vendetta, and enabled by a corporate culture that allows it to happen. He turned to Ethan. "Captain Carter." "What's your perspective?" Ethan, who had quietly observed until now, nodded slowly. "Based on what I witnessed yesterday and what we've just heard, I agree. And I've seen this pattern before, though rarely this blatant." Morales raised a hand, as if to pacify. "Mr. Everett, Mr. Everett, I understand your frustration. Let me fix this immediately," Tony Morales said, his voice trying to maintain calm. "I'll reinstate your son's original tickets, upgrade them to first class on all flights for the next year, and ensure this incident is fully investigated. You're treating symptoms, not the root cause," Elijah Everett replied, his tone unshaken. "My sons don't need special treatment. They need fair treatment, and so does every other passenger, especially those whose parents can't fly to Bay Bridge to demand justice on their behalf." He leaned forward, bracing both hands on Morales' desk. "Here's what's going to happen. You'll reinstate their tickets as promised. You'll provide written documentation of everything we uncovered today, including the manual overrides entered by Lauren Mitchell and Gregory Shields, and you'll arrange a meeting for me with your CEO, Victoria Hargrove, within the next 24 hours. Ms. Hargrove's schedule is very tight. I don't have that authority," Morales stammered. "Then I suggest you find someone who does." Elijah cut in, his voice hardening. "Because if not, I'll take everything I've learned today along with the documentation. I'll request through legal discovery straight to the media and my legal team that specializes in discrimination cases. And I can guarantee they'll be very interested in this one." The air in the room thickened, like water starting to freeze. Morales looked from Elijah to Ethan Carter and back again. Searching for an escape, there wasn't one. at last. He nodded and picked up the phone. As Morales stepped out to make the call, Elijah turned to Ethan, a question forming in his mind. You said this wasn't the first time you've seen things like this. How common is it inside transatlantic? Ethan considered his words carefully. Not everyone is like that, he began. Many of my colleagues are good people, dedicated, respectful to all passengers. But there's a cultural complacency, an unspoken understanding that some passengers are more important than others. That profit matters more than principle. And what happens to the people who speak up? Elijah asked. What happens to them? Ethan gave a dry chuckle. They usually get reassigned to less desirable routes, passed over for promotions, or placed under a microscope for minor mistakes. Nothing big enough to sue over, but enough to send a message staying quiet is safer. Graveyard shifts, denied vacation requests, that kind of thing. Elijah nodded knowingly, clearly having encountered similar tactics in the corporate world. Exactly. Ethan agreed. Death by 1,000 cuts. No single wound deep enough to fight. But together, they speak volumes. Morales returned, his expression a mix of exhaustion and resignation. Ms. Hargrove will meet with you at 9 a.m. tomorrow at the headquarters in Lakeford. Her assistant will send you the details by email, and your son's tickets have been reinstated. TM 573:15 p.m. Today, first class. As originally scheduled. Thank you, Elijah said, his tone making it clear this was only the beginning. I'll also be expecting that documentation today. Leaving Morales' office, the two men walked through the bustling operations center. Elijah reflected on his approach. At first, he had planned to use power and resources to make transatlantic pay a message to the entire industry. But his conversation with Ethan had shifted his thinking. I'd like to ask a favor, he said as they exited into the public area of the terminal. Would you be willing to speak with my sons before their flight? I think they'd appreciate hearing directly from you that what they experienced was seen and taken seriously. Ethan looked surprised. Of course, but you've already handled everything. This isn't just about getting them home safely, Elijah explained. It's about the lesson they take from this experience. You showed them that standing up for what's right is worth it even when there's a cost. I want them to remember that. Ethan nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. You're worried they'll grow cynical. I'm trying to balance justice with hope, Elijah admitted. I want them to know the world can be unjust, that bias is real, but I also want them to see that people like you still exist, people willing to do what's right. Ethan smiled slightly. Now I understand why your sons left such an impression on me. Clearly, they've been raised well. He glanced at his watch. As it happens, I'm the captain on the 3:15 flight today. Seeing them again on board will be no problem. If you'd like, I can meet with the boys before the flight. Ethan Carter offered, glancing at his watch. Perfect. Elijah Everett replied, genuine gratitude in his eyes. And what about you? Ethan, are you worried about any personal fallout for getting involved in all of this? The question seemed to catch the captain off guard, as if consequences were secondary to doing what was right. I suppose I should be, he admitted. But there's something Caleb said yesterday that keeps echoing in my mind. When I asked about the goal of the app they're developing for students with learning challenges, he said they just wanted to create something useful, wanted to make a difference. Ethan gave the strap of his flight bag a gentle squeeze, as if the small gesture could steady him amid the swirl of thoughts. It made me realize how long it's been since I worked with that kind of clarity of purpose. So no, I'm not especially afraid. There are moments in life when the cost of silence outweighs the risk of speaking up. Elijah looked at the man before him with deepening respect. In the tech world Elijah inhabited, declarations about changing the world were a dime a dozen, most of them driven by ego or profit. But Ethan was simply choosing to do the right thing without fanfare, without spotlight. In that case, Elijah said, extending his hand, I hope we can continue this conversation, maybe on the flight back to Lakeford tomorrow. Ethan took the handshake firm. No nonsense. I'll be in the cockpit, but after landing, perhaps. I'm curious how your meeting with Victoria Hargrove goes. So am I, Alea said with a tight smile. It held no amusement, only an unshakable resolve. The headquarters of Trans-American Airlines in Lakeford stood as a modern fortress of glass and steel, dominating a prized corner of the city's financial district. Its gleaming facade reflected the morning sun, as if to signal innovation, efficiency, and responsibility. Elijah stepped into the grand lobby calm in posture, though a storm churned inside. In the 24 hours since shaking hands with Ethan Carter, he had prepared for every possible outcome. His legal team had reviewed 5 years' worth of discrimination complaints against Trans-American, revealing a pattern that would be hard to refute. His media strategists had built a cross-platform response campaign, ready to launch if the meeting didn't go well. And his financial analysts had pinpointed the airline's most vulnerable operational and partnership nodes. But more important than any of that, Elijah had spent 2 hours on a video call the night before with Caleb and Miles after the boys had made it home safely from Bay Bridge, thanks to the flight captained by Ethan. Dad, we don't want you to go nuclear over this, Caleb had said, his tone serious despite his straightforward language. This isn't about payback, Miles added. It's about making sure people see fairness, especially kids who don't have a dad like you. Those words didn't just keep Elijah grounded, they reshaped his entire strategy. Anger was easy. Lasting change was hard. As Elijah stepped through the revolving glass doors into the lobby, a young woman in a sharp suit approached. Mr. Everett, I'm Diane Fletcher, Ms. Hargrove's executive assistant. She's expecting you. Please follow me. The elevator ride to the top floor passed in silence. Diane didn't make small talk. Perhaps she'd been instructed not to. Elijah used those final quiet moments to lock in his objective. Don't leave this building with just promises. Get commitments concrete, measurable, with deadlines. Victoria Hargrove's office opened to a sweeping view of Lake Michigan, the perfect backdrop for the confrontation to come. The poised, silver-haired woman stepped away from her desk to greet Elijah, her eyes sharp and measuring every one of his responses. Mr. Everett, Victoria Hargrove said, extending her hand. It's a pleasure to meet you, though I wish it were under different circumstances. Elijah Everett shook her hand, assessing the woman before him. In her early 60s, impeccably dressed in a conservative suit that exuded authority. Her eyes were sharp, missing nothing, and her faint smile didn't reach them. This was a woman who had survived decades in a male-dominated industry, someone who had made tough decisions and lived with the consequences, someone who understood power and how to wield it. In a different context, Elijah might have respected her, but today, she was simply an obstacle to overcome. Thank you for making time, Elijah said curtly. Please, have a seat. Victoria gestured toward the seating area by the window, avoiding the desk, which would have created unnecessary formality. A strategic move, Elijah noted, designed to feel open and egalitarian, but still with her firmly in control. A young staffer entered with a tray of water and coffee, then exited quickly. Once the door clicked shut, Victoria began. "I've reviewed the report regarding your son's experience," she said calmly, though not without a touch of formality. "First, allow me to apologize. What they went through does not align with the standards we set. We are taking it very seriously." "I appreciate the sentiment," Elijah responded in a professional tone, "but I didn't come here for an apology. I came for action. This wasn't an isolated incident. Ms. Hargrove, it's symptomatic of a broader cultural issue inside Transamerican One that affects not just my family, but many passengers without the means to speak up." If Victoria was surprised by his directness, she didn't show it. "I understand your concern. Like any airline, we've had incidents, and we've strengthened training and review procedures. But I don't agree that this is a systemic problem." "You really believe that?" Elijah asked, opening his briefcase and pulling out a slim folder, placing it on the table. "This is an analysis of discrimination-related complaints filed against Transamerican over the past 5 years. Compared to industry averages, the data shows a very clear pattern." Victoria glanced at the folder but didn't open it. "I'm aware of our numbers. Mr. Everett, context is important. We serve millions of passengers each year across highly diverse routes. A few complaints, while unfortunate, don't indicate a trend." "It's more than a few," Elijah said, "and the content of the complaints is disturbingly consistent, disproportionately targeting passengers of color, especially in first class, or those flying on discounted fares." A flicker, whether of discomfort or reluctant recognition, crossed Victoria's eyes before her composed expression returned. "Mr. Everett, I suspect you're not here just to present statistics." "You're right," Elijah said plainly. "I'm here to demand meaningful change, not just for my sons, but for every passenger who deserves to be treated with fairness, regardless of how they look or how they paid for their ticket." He leaned slightly forward, voice steady and low. "I want 3 things. First, a transparent investigation into my son's case, and appropriate disciplinary action for those involved, including Gerald Shields, who abused his authority for personal retaliation. That is deeply alarming." Victoria tensed slightly at the mention of Gerald, a reaction that confirmed Elijah's instinct that he was a key figure in her inner circle. "Second," he continued, "a full audit of Transamerican's training and oversight programs conducted by a qualified, independent third party with expertise in bias prevention, the findings to be made public, along with a commitment to implement the recommendations." "And the third?" Victoria asked, giving nothing away in response to the first 2 demands. "Third, I want Transamerican to establish a Passenger Equity Advisory Council with real decision-making power, composed of members from diverse backgrounds and lived experiences, to review and help shape policies from the perspective of those most impacted." Victoria paused for a few seconds, her eyes scanning him as if she were analyzing a billion-dollar deal. "These are not minor requests, Mr. Everett. Some could be seen as deeply intrusive to the operations of a publicly traded company. They are necessary steps for meaningful reform," Elijah replied firmly, "and far less intrusive than the class action lawsuit and media campaign I will launch if we can't come to an agreement." It was a direct threat, calm, but resolute. Victoria Hargrove didn't flinch. "You've made your position clear," she said, rising from her seat and walking to the window, turning her back to Elijah Everett for a moment as she gazed out over the expansive lake. When she turned back, her demeanor had shifted, not just a corporate defender, but a strategist recalibrating. "I've done my research on you as well, Mr. Everett," she began. "You built Everett Innovations from the ground up into a global tech conglomerate. You've navigated hostile mergers, legal showdowns, and market volatility that sank other companies, and you've maintained a reputation for ethical business rare in your field. She returned to her seat, eyes sharper now. So I'm going to assume you're not just a wealthy parent throwing weight around because your children were mistreated. I'll assume you actually care about the deeper issues. A fair assumption. Elijah nodded, curious to see where she was heading. Then allow me to be direct, Victoria continued. The airline industry operates on razor-thin margins, even in good times. We're still recovering from the pandemic. Every policy, every personnel decision is calculated to optimize efficiency and profitability while ensuring safety standards remain absolute. In that context, sweeping reforms like the ones you're proposing are not just a financial challenge, they're a cultural one. She paused, carefully weighing her next words. That said, I don't deny the seriousness of what happened. What your sons experienced was mishandled at multiple levels, and Gerald Shields' involvement is concerning. It will be addressed. As for the systemic concerns you raised, I've been in this industry long enough to know when duct tape won't fix the leak. Elijah sensed a shift from confrontation to possible collaboration. What are you proposing? A more targeted approach, Victoria said. I'll authorize an independent investigation into the incident, with appropriate disciplinary action, including for Shields. I'll also commit to reviewing our training programs and accountability mechanisms, with a renewed focus on preventing bias in passenger service. She raised her hand gently as Elijah began to respond. However, instead of publishing the report publicly, which would feed the media and our competitors, I propose creating a small advisory council. It would include external experts in bias prevention and passenger rights, working directly with our executive team to recommend improvements and evaluation metrics. No public accountability. How do you expect to ensure real progress? Elijah challenged. We'll report quarterly to the board, Victoria replied, and share key outcomes with major stakeholders. There will also be a direct communication channel between the advisory council and you if you're willing to remain engaged. It wasn't everything Elijah had demanded, but it was more practical than he'd expected. A path to genuine change while allowing Hargrove to retain narrative and operational control. A compromise that acknowledged the legitimacy of his demands, even if not fully embracing them. I need to ensure the investigation is truly independent and that the advisory council has real authority. Elijah responded, neither accepting nor rejecting. And I want Ethan Carter, the captain from that flight, involved in the process. His perspective as a veteran employee will be invaluable. Victoria's eyes flickered with surprise. Carter, the pilot who intervened when your sons were mistreated? That's him, Elijah confirmed. He showed integrity in a difficult moment and has an insider's understanding of the operational conditions that produce these issues. The perspective of someone who's long observed in silence and has now chosen to speak is incredibly valuable, Elijah added. For the first time in their meeting, Victoria's smile wasn't calculated. It was genuine. On that, I agree with you, Mr. Everett. She extended her hand. I believe we've established the foundation of a working agreement. My legal team will draft the formal terms for your review later this week. They shook hands, and Elijah felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't the sweeping punishment he had originally envisioned, but it had the potential to create change far more lasting than a short-lived media storm. One more thing, Elijah said as the meeting neared its end. I'd like to speak with your PR team before I leave. I have a statement I'd like to release, aligned with the spirit of today's discussion. Victoria raised an eyebrow, caution returning. And what would that statement be? Everett Innovations will be launching a scholarship program for minority youth aspiring to enter the aviation industry. Elijah elaborated on the scholarship program, full funding for education, internships, and access to direct mentorship. I believe if Transamerican joins this initiative by offering internship placements and exposure to the industry, it would send a powerful message. The tension in Victoria Hargrove's posture visibly softened. That's a very generous proposal. And yes, I believe we can arrange such a partnership. It would demonstrate our commitment to fostering diversity beyond the bounds of current operations. What neither of them said, but both clearly understood, was that this collaboration would also serve as a public affirmation that Transamerican was actively addressing its diversity issues, helping to mitigate reputational risk from the incident involving Elijah Everett's sons. It was a strategic move, one that served both parties and could create real opportunities for deserving students, a compromise Elijah could accept. An hour later, as he exited Transamerican's headquarters, having finalized preliminary details with Hargrove's PR team, Elijah reflected on the negotiation, a delicate dance of power, principle, and pragmatism. He had come prepared for battle, armed with litigation and media strategy, but he left with a partnership imperfect, but one that opened a door to real change, something a scorched-earth approach might never have achieved. His phone buzzed a message from Ethan Carter, confirming their dinner plans before the flight back to Bay Bridge. The pilot had become an unexpected ally with a quiet integrity that reminded Elijah real change often begins with individual decisions, not top-down mandates. Sliding into the back seat of the car waiting for him, Elijah opened his video call app, smiling at the thought of what he was about to share with Caleb and Miles. The boys had gone through something no parent wants their child to endure, but perhaps, in how the adults around them had responded to that hardship, they would learn something even more valuable: the power of principled voice, of strategic compromise, and of the quiet courage shown by people like Ethan Carter, a man who chose to stand up when standing down would have been easier. It wasn't a perfect ending. The world rarely offers those, but it was a step forward toward the kind of world Elijah hoped his sons would help build, through their choices and their creations. And for him, today, that was enough. As the indigo dust settled over Lakeford, Ethan Carter walked into the riverfront restaurant where he had arranged to meet Elijah Everett. His day had been a string of tense meetings, starting with a subtly loaded conversation with the fleet director, who had questioned him about his improper protocol engagement with a passenger concerning operational matters, a thinly veiled reference to his help at Bay Bridge the day before. Ethan had expected a reprimand, maybe even an internal review, but instead, he'd been told he was under consideration for a position on a newly formed Service Quality Advisory Board at corporate headquarters. Even the director had looked slightly puzzled, hinting that the directive had come from somewhere very high up, when Ethan spotted Elijah seated at a corner table, gazing out at the twinkling reflections on the Lakeford River. He couldn't help but wonder what exactly had gone down in that meeting with Victoria Hargrove. He'd known of Elijah for years, a tech founder who had famously turned down short-term profits in favor of principle, and was respected in an industry that often dismissed both. The way Elijah had handled what happened to his sons, calm, forceful, but never angry, revealed a depth that business media rarely captured in profiles of men like him. "Elijah," Ethan called, smiling as he extended a hand. "Glad you made it. I hope today didn't wear you out too much after yesterday's adventure. Let's just call it an unexpected turning point," Elijah replied as they sat across from each other. "I believe I owe you thanks for the special attention I've suddenly received from people who hadn't noticed me once in 27 years. Elijah chuckled, genuinely this time. "I might have suggested that your perspective could be valuable to the upcoming reform efforts. I hope I didn't overstep." "Not at all," Ethan said, "though I am a bit curious about what those reforms will look like." He took a sip of water. You clearly made quite an impression on Victoria Hargrove, who's known for being nearly immovable." As the two men ordered appetizers, Elijah began recounting the details of his morning meeting, everything from the agreement he'd reached with Hargrove to the scholarship initiative that would become the public face of this new direction. Ethan Carter listened intently, struck by the strategic clarity how Elijah had balanced responsibility with realism. "You know," Ethan said when Elijah finished, "when I first met you, part of me expected a media storm, a legal firestorm, every tool someone like you could unleash. I wouldn't have blamed you if you'd reacted more fiercely after what happened to your sons." Ethan Carter said softly, "That was my first instinct." Elijah Everett admitted, "But something you said yesterday kept echoing in my mind Michael's advice about knowing when anger is useful and when it only weighs you down." He paused, swirling the wine in his glass, deep in thought. "And then Caleb and Miles reminded me this wasn't about payback. It was about making sure other kids, the ones without the privileges mine have, don't have to go through the same thing." Ethan nodded, a bittersweet pride rising in his chest as he saw Michael's philosophy still resonating, years after his son's sacrifice. "Your sons are impressive young men." Elijah smiled. "I think so too, though I can't take too much credit. Their mother is the one who really raised them right. But in many ways, they've taught me more, especially how to look beyond the immediate reaction and see the larger picture." Their conversation flowed smoothly through dinner, from the Trans-American incident to their respective industries. The struggle of upholding principles in systems obsessed with efficiency and convenience. Eventually, they turned to fatherhood, what they hoped to leave behind, the mistakes they'd made, and the lessons they'd learned. "You know," Ethan said as they sipped post-dinner coffee, "when I stood up for those boys, I never imagined it would lead to this." He gestured around, not just the table, but the entire chain of events, the ripple effect. Elijah nodded. One small decision triggering consequences no one could foresee. Sometimes negative, but sometimes. He trailed off, distracted by something over Ethan's shoulder. Ethan turned and was surprised to see Lauren Mitchell, the lead flight attendant behind the controversy, entering the restaurant with an older man who had the air of a retired military officer. A host led them to a table on the far side. Lauren chatted animatedly with her companion. It was clearly a personal dinner, not a business one. "What are the odds?" Ethan murmured. "Or," Elijah said, lifting his gaze, eyes thoughtful, "maybe this is one of those moments when the universe offers us a chance for what Ethan asked, wary, a chance to close the loop." Alicia replied, "A conversation that otherwise would never happen." He looked directly at Ethan, as if asking a question deeper than words. "What would you think if I invited them to join us for a drink?" Ethan blinked. "You want to sit with the woman who discriminated against your sons and tried to downgrade their seats?" "I want to understand," Elijah clarified, "to hear it from her, to see if there's something we haven't considered that might help with the change we're trying to build." He paused. "And I won't deny it. I want to know who the person behind the action really is." Ethan Carter hesitated. His gut reaction was discomfort. But then he admitted to himself in this context, it might be a conversation worth having. "It's your dinner," he said. "But fair warning, Lauren Mitchell isn't exactly known for accepting criticism." "I'm not here to criticize," Elijah said calmly. "Just to listen and maybe offer a perspective she hasn't heard before." Ethan watched as Elijah Everett crossed the room, every bit as composed and confident as he always was. There was a moment of clear tension when Lauren Mitchell noticed the two men approaching. But something in Elijah's manner, perhaps the complete absence of anger, or simply the sincere intent to engage, caused Lauren's guard to lower slightly. Surprisingly, she and the man with her, Richard Mitchell, her father, accepted the invitation and joined their table. The conversation began stiffly, the air heavy with recent history, but Elijah carefully steered the exchange away from confrontation and toward shared experience. And gradually, a more complex picture of Lauren Mitchell began to emerge. She spoke of her 20-year career at Transamerican, starting in an era when female flight attendants faced harassment and absurd expectations. She had been groped by passengers, overlooked by managers for not being soft enough, and trained in an unspoken system where career success hinged on pleasing elite passengers, even if it meant marginalizing others. "That doesn't excuse what happened to your sons," she said, finally meeting Elijah's eyes. "But after decades of being drilled to believe that my job existed to keep VIPs happy, my instinct when I heard Mr. Winter's accusation wasn't, 'Is this fair?' It was, 'How do I contain this without risking my job?'" Elijah asked gently, without judgment. "So when Captain Carter challenged your decision, what went through your mind?" Lauren Mitchell glanced at Ethan, her eyes a conflicted mix of resentment and a reluctant trace of respect. "It felt like betrayal," she said quietly, "like you were undermining my authority in front of the passengers. We're taught to present a united front, even when someone's wrong." "Even when wrong?" Ethan asked gently. "How was I supposed to know I was wrong?" Lauren shot back, the edge of a long-worn defensiveness surfacing. "In 20 years, not once has a pilot questioned the way I handle passengers. The company culture doesn't allow it. Everyone stays in their lane." Richard Mitchell, her father, who had remained silent until now, gently placed a hand on her arm. "Lauren," he said softly, "remember what I told you about habits we don't even recognize." That quiet reminder had more effect than any confrontation. Lauren exhaled deeply, her shoulders easing just slightly. "My dad's a retired Marine Corps officer," she explained to Ethan and Elijah. "He's been helping me realize that sometimes the reflexes we're trained to rely on are the same ones that cause us to make the wrong calls. It's not easy to recognize when the patterns that were once rewarded have turned harmful." Elijah said thoughtfully, "In tech, we call that a successful failure, a flawed strategy that yields short-term results. So people keep using it without seeing the long-term damage." The conversation shifted toward systems and organizational culture, how biased behaviors aren't just tolerated, but sometimes subtly incentivized. Richard, drawing from his military background, shared insights about leadership and institutional reform, complementing the personal and professional experiences Ethan and Elijah brought to the table. By the time dinner ended, no one expected a dramatic reconciliation or a grand public apology. The harm and missteps of the past few days couldn't be undone in a single meal. But what remained was a fragile, genuine bridge, an initial understanding that, if nurtured, could lead to real change. "I'd like to learn more about the advisory council," Lauren said as the group stood to leave. "Not that I expect to be invited, considering my role in what happened, but I have observations from 20 years of service I've never had a chance to voice." Ethan and Elijah exchanged a look. "I think that's a conversation worth having," Elijah replied. "Not for optics, but because real change requires input from every level of the organization, especially from those who've lived through the dysfunction." Outside the restaurant, Richard Mitchell pulled Ethan aside. "You did something very brave on that flight," he said, his eyes firm and clear. "Standing up when staying silent would have been easier. I recognized it the moment Lauren told me the story, anger and all. That's the kind of moral courage we used to try to instill in our officers, doing what's right when it's the hardest thing to do." Those words stayed with Ethan as he walked back to his hotel. the cold night wind from Lakeford brushing his face. The past few days had been a whirlwind of confrontation, truth, and unexpected alliances. Tomorrow, he would return to his regular duties flying above the clouds, as he had for nearly 3 decades. But something inside him had shifted. Not just because of his new title on the Service Quality Advisory Board, but because of a changed awareness, an awakening to the fact that he could help shift a system he once thought immovable. His phone buzzed, a message from Alina Daniels, the co-pilot from that fateful flight. Heard you're shaking things up at HQ. Didn't see that plot twist coming. Steady, Carter. Ethan chuckled. That nickname, once referring only to his composure in the cockpit, now carried a new layer of meaning. Maybe being steady wasn't just about keeping a plane level in turbulence, but about holding to principle under the weight of an unjust system. He thought of Michael, his son, whose unshakable integrity sometimes made Ethan feel like he had more to learn than to teach. In the past few days, for the first time in 8 years, Ethan felt he had truly honored that legacy, not just in memory, but in action. Another message arrived. From Elijah, safe flight tomorrow. The real conversation's only just begun. The work starts here. Ethan typed back a simple reply. Ready when you are. And he meant it. He was ready. Ethan Carter stood at the podium in the Lakeford International Airport Conference Hall, facing representatives from all corners of Trans-American Airlines senior executives, frontline staff, pilots, and baggage handlers alike. Beside him stood members of the newly formed Service Quality Advisory Council, a body born out of the pivotal meeting between Elijah Everett and Victoria Hargrove 3 months prior. Among them was Lauren Mitchell, whose journey from defensive resistance to proactive advocacy had surprised many, perhaps even herself. The changes we're implementing, from revised training protocols to anonymous reporting systems, peer support networks to the Community Advisory Board, are not final solutions. Ethan began. They are tools. And like any tools, they're only as effective as the integrity and purpose with which we choose to use them. His gaze swept the room, meeting the attentive eyes of Victoria Hargrove, a small nod from Lauren, and at the back of the room, Elijah Everett with his 2 sons, Caleb and Miles Dawson, who had insisted on attending this presentation of the Council's findings. 3 months ago, an incident occurred, one of thousands of disappointing moments that might have been forgotten by most, and silently endured by a few. Ethan continued, but this time it became a catalyst for reflection, and ultimately for change. Not because of the power or influence of one individual, but because enough people were willing to admit that the status quo was harming not just our passengers, but ourselves, our commitment to service, to professional dignity, and to our shared humanity. After the presentation, as breakout discussions began, Caleb and Miles approached Ethan. Both of them had visibly matured since that fateful flight. Mr. Carter, Caleb said, shaking his hand with a sincere smile. That was an amazing speech. It's hard to believe so much has changed because you chose to speak up that day. I think you're giving me too much credit, Ethan replied with a smile. If you two hadn't held yourselves with such dignity in that moment, if your father hadn't used his influence to create something constructive instead of seeking punishment, if Lauren hadn't been willing to re-examine herself without any of those pieces, the outcome could have been completely different. Like what we're learning in systems design, Miles added thoughtfully. Complex problems need multiple points of intervention. No single action can fix an entire system. Exactly. Ethan nodded, impressed by his insight. But sometimes, it's a single action that reveals where the pressure points are. At that moment, Elijah joined them, having just wrapped up a conversation with Victoria Hargrove. "The boys have a bit of news to share with you," he told Ethan. Caleb and Miles exchanged excited glances. "The application we've been developing for students with learning disabilities," Caleb began, "has been picked up by an edtech company for national rollout. They're helping us scale it. And we just got accepted into the MIT Young Founders program this summer," Miles added. "We'll be working with neuroscience researchers to refine the adaptive algorithm using the latest cognitive science." "That's incredible," Ethan said, genuinely delighted. "But I'm not surprised you two have vision and drive. That's rare at any age." As they spoke, Lauren Mitchell approached slowly, her expression clearly tinged with hesitation despite the months of close collaboration. Ethan said nothing, simply shifted aside to make space a small gesture that reflected the larger spirit of change they were all working toward. "Ms. Mitchell," Elijah greeted her with a respectful nod. "Your presentation on the new training protocols was very well received. The emphasis on real-life scenarios over theory was exactly the approach we discussed." "Thank you," Lauren replied, visibly relieved that Elijah had maintained a professional tone rather than revisiting the past. "Putting that material together really forced me to confront some blind spots in my own awareness." She turned to the two boys, meeting their eyes for the first time since the incident on the flight. "I owe you both an apology," Lauren Mitchell said softly, "not just for what happened on that flight, but for the assumptions I didn't even realize I was making. You deserved better." The moment hung between them, full of potential for healing or for further distance. It was Miles Dawson, the quieter of the two brothers, who spoke first. "My mom always says the hardest part is realizing you were wrong," he said. "Everything after that is just about whether you're willing to make it right." He gave a small smile. "I think you're doing that." The air softened, not a full reconciliation, but a shift, an understanding that forgiveness, like systemic change, is a process, not a moment. As the event drew to a close and attendees began to depart, Ethan Carter stood by the window with Elijah Everett, looking out at the runway where planes taxied and took off with the rhythmic precision he'd loved since he was a boy. "About your retirement next month," Elijah said, breaking the warm silence. "Are you sure this is the right time?" Ethan nodded. The decision one he had weighed carefully over the past few weeks. 30 years is a long enough journey. And now that the advisory council is transitioning into a permanent ethics committee, I feel it's the right time to make space for the next generation. Elijah looked over at his sons, who were deep in conversation with a few younger airline employees in the corner. "Do you have any regrets?" Ethan paused, then answered truthfully. "Only that it took me too long to find my voice," he said. "Too many years spent quiet, convincing myself that small compromises didn't matter. But it turns out, those small compromises are exactly what shape a culture." "But when it truly mattered," Elijah said, "you made the right choice." "That counts." "It does." Ethan agreed. "My son once told me that a person's character isn't defined by their best or worst moments, but by the everyday choices that quietly accumulate over time." They glanced over to where Lauren Mitchell was now standing with Caleb and Miles, engaged in genuine conversation. Bridges were being built across generations, across perspectives. "Speaking of what comes after retirement," Elijah continued, "Washington Innovations is expanding into EdTech, especially tools for neurodiverse learners. We're looking for someone with a comprehensive view, someone who understands both systems and people." Ethan chuckled lightly. "I'm not exactly a tech expert." "We have plenty of tech experts," Elijah replied. "What we don't have enough of are people who understand how humans move through systems and who have the courage to stand firm when those systems break down. They kept talking as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the runway. From where they stood, the airport looked like a miniature society, people from all walks of life, crossing paths briefly, governed by shared rules and mutual respect. 3 months earlier, a moment of injustice on an otherwise ordinary flight had sparked a chain of events no one could have predicted. That chain had led them here not to a perfect resolution, nor a sweeping revolution, but to a new beginning, a different direction, a community of people committed to making their corner of the world a little fairer, one decision at a time. Not everything, but something. And sometimes, Ethan thought, as he watched the two boys who had unknowingly started this journey now helping to shape its future, something is enough to change everything. We've just walked through a long journey, not just a story about a disrupted flight or seemingly minor misunderstandings. This was a journey of awakening, a journey of people who stood up not because they weren't afraid of loss, but because they could no longer stay silent. Ethan Carter, a captain, whose only duty, it seemed, was to keep the plane steady, chose to also steady his conscience. Elijah Everett, a father who could have used his power for retaliation, chose instead the path of building and reform. And Caleb and Miles Dawson, two teenagers who appeared to be nothing more than passengers on a flight, became the spark for a movement of change far bigger than themselves. The people in this story weren't perfect. They made mistakes. They hesitated. They faced a system so entrenched it seemed immovable. But it was within that imperfection that hope emerged because they chose what was right, at a time when silence would have been easier. Change doesn't come from grand speeches or loud press releases. It begins with the small things, a refusal to search a bag without evidence, a firm phone call, a genuine apology, or a handshake after a tense meeting. Each of those moments, seemingly insignificant, contributes to rewriting a system once driven by inertia and privilege. Maybe you've been a passenger on a similar flight, not necessarily in the sky, but somewhere in life. Maybe you felt dismissed, judged by appearances, or stayed silent in the face of injustice to protect your own safety. But this story reminds us you can be the start of change. All it takes is one action, no matter how small. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that justice, compassion, and kindness still have a place in this world, leave a like, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Stories where people don't just exist, but strive to live more kindly each day. Because big change always begins with a small story. And who knows, maybe one day, your story will be the start of something greater.